In the summer of 1987, two siblings, Marcus, 14, and Sophie, 12, inherited their grandmother's farmhouse in the Bavarian Alps, nestled between limestone cliffs that had guarded secrets for centuries. Among her scattered belongings, they found a hand-drawn map, decades old, marked with cryptic symbols and a single annotation in faded pencil. Where the earth remembers the old gods. Their grandmother had spent her final years researching local archaeology, obsessed with legends of Celtic and Germanic tribes who once inhabited these mountains. The siblings assumed it was merely historical enthusiasm until they discovered a journal detailing her conviction that a pagan sanctuary lay hidden within the cave system beneath the property. What began as curiosity during a rainy afternoon became an obsession. Sophie, studious and methodical, pored over the map and her grandmother's notes. Marcus, restless and adventurous, saw only the promise of exploration. Their parents, occupied with renovating the farmhouse, barely noticed the two slipping into the forest with flashlights and rope. Neither child understood that some discoveries demand more than courage. They demand sacrifice, wisdom, and the willingness to confront not just the mysteries of the past, but the uncertainties within themselves. The caves waited, dark, ancient, holding something that had been buried intentionally, protected by stone and time and deliberate obscurity. Within those limestone chambers, bioluminescent organisms thrived in the perpetual damp, creating an otherworldly luminescence that would transform the children's understanding of history and of each other. What they would find was not merely an artifact, but a mirror, reflecting the bonds that held them together and the choices that would define them forever. Chapter 1. The Map and the Question. The farmhouse smelled of dust and old wood, the kind of smell that clung to furniture no one had touched in years. Marcus dragged boxes down from the attic, sneezing with each armful, while Sophie sat cross-legged on the bedroom floor, sorting through their grandmother's possessions with the reverence of an archaeologist. Their parents were 3 rooms away, measuring walls and discussing paint colors. No one was watching. Sophie pulled a leather journal from beneath a stack of faded photographs. The cover was embossed with her grandmother's initials, E.K., Elizabeth Keller, a woman they'd known only through summer visits and birthday cards. Marcus dropped beside his sister, peering over her shoulder as she opened the first page. The handwriting was precise, almost architectural, filling margins with sketches of cave formations and mountain topography. She was looking for something, Sophie whispered, though there was no reason to whisper. The journal documented years of research, local folklore, references to Celtic settlements, interviews with elderly residents who remembered stories their parents had told them about Die alten Götter, the old gods. Elizabeth had marked passages about Germanic tribes, about ritual sites in mountainous regions, about the deliberate burial of sacred objects. One entry, dated March 1982, read, "The pattern fits, the symbols match the rock formations. If I'm right, it's beneath the eastern slope, hidden, waiting." Tucked between the final pages was a map, hand-drawn on aged paper with annotations in the same precise script. A cave system was sketched with careful detail, multiple chambers, a narrow passage, and an X marking a location near what Elizabeth had labeled the Stone Circle. A single phrase appeared at the bottom, "Where the earth remembers the old gods." Marcus traced the map with his finger. She found it, or thought she did. "No," Sophie said, her voice steady. "She found the location. She never went in." The certainty in Sophie's tone was unsettling. Marcus looked at his sister. She was studying another page, a letter never sent, addressed to someone named Thomas. The first line made Marcus's breath catch. "I cannot explore alone. The caves are deep. I am afraid." Outside, the wind moved through the pines, a low and patient sound. Inside, two children held history in their hands and made a decision that would reshape the summer and perhaps their entire lives. "We have to look," Marcus said. Sophie closed the journal carefully. "Tomorrow, we plan first. We research. We don't go in unprepared." But even as she spoke, Sophie was already mentally retracing the symbols on the map, already imagining the stone chambers beneath the earth, already feeling the pull of something ancient and insistent. Their grandmother had left more than a farmhouse. She had left a question, and the only way to answer it was to walk into the darkness. Chapter 2. Preparation and Doubt. The next morning, they set out before breakfast, carrying the map, a notebook, a compass, and hiking gear borrowed from the farmhouse garage. Their parents were still asleep. Renovation work had exhausted them. The forest path was familiar enough. They'd explored it during previous summers, but always within eyeshot of the farmhouse. Now, with the map as their guide, the forest seemed to shift into something more intentional, more purposeful. Sophie navigated using both the compass and the map's annotations. Every half-kilometre, Elizabeth had sketched a landmark, a distinctive split boulder, a cluster of white rocks, a moss-covered formation that resembled an animal's skull. They found each one, and with each discovery, the forest seemed to acknowledge their presence, to draw them deeper into its geometry. Marcus kept glancing over his shoulder. "Are you sure about this? If our parents find out—" "They won't," Sophie interrupted. But she wasn't certain either. She was 13 years old, and she was leading them toward an unmapped cave system based on a dead woman's map and intuition. The rationality that usually guided her was fracturing slightly, replaced by something that felt like magnetism, an invisible pull toward discovery. By mid-morning, they reached the eastern slope. The landscape changed abruptly. What had been forest opened into a clearing where limestone formations jutted from the earth like broken teeth. Vegetation thinned. The air shifted, becoming cooler, carrying the mineral scent of stone and subterranean moisture. And there, partially hidden by an overgrown tangle of ivy and roots, was an opening, a cave mouth, roughly triangular, perhaps 2 meters tall. Sophie's heart accelerated. Marcus moved forward, then stopped. "We need flashlights," he said. "Real ones, and rope, and—" "We have all of it at the farmhouse," Sophie said. "In the garage." Elizabeth kept equipment. "I saw it." "How did you—" "I looked yesterday after you fell asleep." This silenced Marcus. Their grandmother had left more than a map. She had left tools. She had left preparations for a journey she'd never taken, waiting, perhaps, for someone with enough curiosity and courage to finish what she'd started. Sophie touched the cool stone of the cave mouth. It was real. Everything was real. The summer stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and risk. She felt the weight of decision pressing down, the simultaneous thrill and terror of crossing a threshold that, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. "Tomorrow," Sophie said. "We come back tomorrow with everything we need and we go in." Marcus looked at his sister's face, determined, afraid, resolute, and he understood that arguing would be pointless. Sophie had already entered the cave in her mind. The only question was whether he would follow. Chapter 3. Into the Darkness. They returned the next afternoon with flashlights, climbing rope, a first aid kit, and a camera, Sophie's insistence to document evidence. Their preparations had taken longer than expected. They'd had to explain to their parents that they were hiking to a waterfall marked on a trail map, a lie that sat uncomfortably but was necessary. The parents, occupied with contractors and building materials, had barely listened. The cave entrance seemed smaller when approached with intention. Marcus played the beam of his flashlight across the stone walls, revealing moisture glistening in the crevices, the faint shimmer of calcite deposits. The air was noticeably cooler. carrying the distinct flavor of deep earth, mineral, ancient, patient. Sophie moved first, stooping slightly to fit through the entrance. Marcus followed. Within 3 meters, sunlight ceased to exist. The world became what the flashlights defined: narrow passages, stone surfaces, and an absolute silence that seemed to have weight. The initial chamber opened unexpectedly, a cathedral-like space, perhaps 10 meters across. Their footsteps echoed, amplified by stone. Sophie's breath came in small clouds, visible in the cold air. She directed the camera upward, capturing the natural ceiling formations, stalactites hanging like stone daggers, formed drop by drop over millennia. "It's beautiful," Marcus breathed. But Sophie was staring at something else. On the chamber wall, roughly 3 meters high, were markings, geometric patterns carved directly into the stone. Triangles interlocked with angular shapes, reminiscent of the symbols Elizabeth had sketched in her journal. Celtic or Germanic in origin, deliberately placed, deliberately preserved. She was right, Sophie said. "This is intentional. This is a sanctuary." They pressed deeper, moving through a narrow passage that descended gradually. The temperature dropped further. The stone beneath their boots became slippery with mineral deposits. Sophie moved cautiously, testing each step. Marcus stayed close, his flashlight creating overlapping shadows that danced across the walls. Then Sophie stopped abruptly. "Look," she pointed. The passage opened into a second chamber, smaller than the first, more intimate, and covering roughly half the chamber's perimeter was something impossible. A luminescence, faint but unmistakable, emanating from the stone itself. The light was pale green, almost spectral, concentrated in patches where moisture clung thickest to the cave walls. Bioluminescent organisms, bacteria or fungi, thriving in the perpetual dark and damp, created an eerie radiance that seemed to pulse in rhythm with their breathing. "It glows," Marcus whispered. Sophie understood, in that moment, why their grandmother had felt compelled to explore and why fear had stopped her. This was sacred space, not supernaturally, but spiritually. Ancient peoples who had discovered these caves, who had ventured into this darkness, must have experienced the luminescence as a sign of divine presence. They would have built rituals around it, left offerings, marked this place as significant. And they had left something else. Near the far wall, barely visible through the green glow, was an angular outline, metallic, geometric, deliberately placed on a stone shelf. Sophie raised her camera. The flash ignited the chamber in brilliant white, bleaching the phosphorescence momentarily. In that instant of clarity, she saw it clearly, a shield, tarnished and ancient, decorated with intricate patterns, waiting in the darkness for exactly this moment. For 2 children with curiosity stronger than fear. If you're enjoying this adventure so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Chapter 4. The Artifact. The shield was smaller than Marcus had expected, perhaps 60 centimeters across, beaten copper or bronze, the surface tarnished to a dark mottled finish. Despite its age, the craftsmanship was evident. Concentric circles formed the outer design, with geometric patterns radiating toward a central umbo, the reinforced dome that would have protected a warrior's hand. Sophie approached it with reverence, keeping her hands away until she could document it. She photographed the shield from multiple angles, the camera's flash briefly overwhelming the cave's bioluminescence before the phosphorescent glow reasserted itself, like a held breath being released. "Don't touch it yet," she instructed, though Marcus hadn't moved. She pulled the journal from her backpack and flipped to a page where Elizabeth had sketched similar shields. The pattern on this artifact matched almost precisely, Celtic design elements mixed with Germanic influences, suggesting a period of cultural exchange, possibly 1st or 2nd century CE. "It's real," Marcus said. The words felt insufficient. Everything was too large, too significant. Sophie finally extended her hand, fingers trembling slightly as they made contact with the shield. The metal was cold, colder than stone, and textured with corrosion that was grainy under her fingertips. She felt the weight of centuries, warriors who had carried this, battles where it had offered protection, rituals where it had held sacred meaning. Marcus moved past the shield, deeper into the chamber. His flashlight caught something else, a stone platform or altar of sorts, constructed from carefully stacked rocks. Upon it rested fragments of pottery, corroded metal objects, and what appeared to be animal bones, arranged with deliberate intent. "Offerings," Marcus said. "People brought things here. They left them intentionally." The sanctuary became suddenly clear in its function. This wasn't merely a cave. It was a sacred space where ancient peoples had made pilgrimages, where they had made sacrifices to gods whose names no longer existed in living memory. The shield wasn't lost treasure. It was an artifact of worship, left here as an offering or a votive object, placed in a chamber lit by mysterious luminescence that would have seemed divine to anyone in the ancient world. Sophie felt the weight of responsibility shift. This wasn't about discovery in the conventional sense. This was about preservation, about honoring what these unknown ancestors had considered sacred. "We need to tell someone," she said. "An archaeologist, a museum. We can't just..." "Can't just what?" Marcus interrupted. "Take it? Leave it? Tell our parents we snuck into unmapped caves?" Sophie didn't answer. The questions were too complex, the implications too layered. Taking the shield meant claiming it, removing it from the sacred context where it had rested for possibly 1,800 years. But leaving it meant risking discovery by someone less respectful, someone who might destroy the site or pillage it without care. A sound echoed through the chamber, distant but unmistakable. Water. The deeper caves contained moving water, probably an underground stream, fed by the same mineral-rich aquifer that sustained the phosphorescent organisms. "We should go," Marcus said, "before it gets darker." But Sophie remained motionless, her hand still on the shield, feeling the centuries of silence, the ancient waiting, and the sudden disruptive arrival of the present moment. Chapter 5. The maps within maps. The ascent from the deeper chambers was slower than their descent, partly from caution, partly because both children were processing the magnitude of what they'd discovered. As they approached the entrance chamber, Marcus noticed something Sophie had overlooked initially, more markings on the stone walls. But these were different. Where the earlier symbols had been abstract patterns, these were directional, arrows pointing deeper into the cave system, alongside notation marks that suggested there were multiple routes, multiple chambers, a complex network rather than a simple cave. "There's more," Marcus said, tracing the markings with his flashlight beam. Sophie pulled out Elizabeth's journal. On a page she'd barely glanced at, their grandmother had sketched what appeared to be a partial map of an entire cave system, multiple interconnected chambers, passages that branched and merged, suggesting an underground labyrinth of considerable complexity. One notation stood out, written in Elizabeth's careful script: the inner sanctum, 3 chambers deeper. The priests kept 2 shields. One was offered, one was hidden. 2 shields. Sophie's stomach tightened. They had found what was meant to be found, an offering shield placed in the luminescent chamber for visitors to discover. But somewhere deeper, in unmapped darkness, was another one, hidden deliberately, protected by whoever had maintained this sanctuary in the final centuries before it was abandoned. "We're not going deeper today," Sophie said, though Marcus hadn't suggested it. "We need to plan. We need to know what we're walking into." They emerged into daylight that seemed shockingly bright after the cave's darkness. The late afternoon sun filtered through the forest canopy, creating dappled patterns on the ground. The normalcy of the forest, birds singing, insects moving through grass, the ordinary sounds of living things, felt alien after the silence of the cave. Neither child spoke as they hiked back toward the farmhouse. They were both processing the implications. Their grandmother had known about not one artifact, but potentially two. She had mapped these caves not as a casual exploration, but as a systematic archaeological investigation. And she had left her research to them, perhaps deliberately, knowing that curiosity combined with youth and courage might achieve what her own advancing age and fear had prevented. That evening, while their parents dined with neighbors, Sophie and Marcus spread Elizabeth's journal across the farmhouse floor, examining every page, every sketch, every notation. They found additional maps hidden in the margins, tiny, detailed drawings that Elizabeth had sketched alongside her primary notes, possibly not even consciously recording them. Marcus pointed to a detail he'd missed before, a date written in the journal's final entry, March 1984, alongside a single sentence: "If I cannot go, perhaps they will. Perhaps they were always meant to." Who? Marcus asked. Who was she writing about? Sophie understood immediately. Their grandmother had known she was dying. The entries became increasingly sparse, the handwriting sometimes shaky. She had documented everything not for herself, but for someone else, someone with the physical capability, the youth, the resilience to complete what she'd started. She had documented it for them. That night, Sophie lay awake, staring at the farmhouse ceiling, feeling the weight of inherited purpose. The caves had been waiting not for archaeologists or academics, but for family, for two children who carried their grandmother's blood and her curiosity, who understood that some quests are passed down across generations like genetic instructions, encoded in family memory and manifested in the irresistible pull toward discovery. Tomorrow they would begin planning the deeper expedition. But tonight, Sophie felt the profound silence of that realization. They were not explorers who had stumbled upon something remarkable. They were participants in a story their grandmother had begun, that they now had to continue, and that was far more significant than any artifact ever could be. Chapter 6. The Rival. 3 days into their exploration routine, Marcus noticed the footprints in the mud outside the cave entrance. They were fresh, made within the last 24 hours, and they didn't belong to Sophie or him. Someone else had been inside the cave. Marcus ran back to the farmhouse, where Sophie was cataloguing Elizabeth's notes. He found her in the attic, surrounded by boxes, photographs, and documents they'd barely begun to examine. "We have a problem," he said, and described what he'd found. Sophie's face went pale. How could they? Who could possibly? Maybe a hiker who stumbled upon it, a local who knows about the caves. But even as Marcus suggested it, he knew it was more than coincidence. Footprints that direct, that deliberate, suggested someone was specifically looking for the cave entrance, someone who knew or suspected what was inside. They returned to the cave that afternoon, moving with more caution than before. In the entrance chamber, they found something that made Sophie's breath catch. Recent tool marks on the stone shelf where they'd left the shield. Someone had been examining it closely, possibly attempting to move it or document it. The shield was still there. They wouldn't have risked taking it without understanding its significance. But now the discovery felt less like an intimate secret and more like a contested resource. "We need to tell someone," Marcus said. "This is beyond us. If someone else is looking for this—" "No!" Sophie's voice was sharp. "If we tell anyone, it becomes official. It becomes archaeology and bureaucracy and museums. It gets taken away. Better that than stolen by someone who doesn't care about the history." Sophie moved past the shield, toward the passages leading deeper into the cave system. "We finish the exploration. We find the second shield. We document everything. Then we decide what to do." But her determination was now laced with something else: urgency. Someone had claimed the hunt as well. The question was no longer whether they would explore the deeper chambers, but whether they would reach them before their unknown rival did. Over the next week they made several expeditions, each one pushing deeper into the cave system, mapping passages, discovering additional chambers. Each contained evidence of ancient occupation: more pottery shards, stone tools, carved walls bearing symbols and patterns. But the inner sanctum, the chamber where Elizabeth had noted the possibility of a second shield, remained elusive. Then, on their 8th expedition, while mapping what they thought was a dead-end passage, Marcus discovered it, a narrow opening that their maps had completely missed, hidden behind a natural pillar of stone. Beyond it lay a passage that descended steeply, and the air flowing from it carried a different quality, damper, carrying the subtle scent of underground water. Sophie squeezed through the opening. The passage descended for perhaps 30 meters before opening into a chamber that took her breath away. It was larger than the sanctuary chamber, perhaps 15 meters across, and the walls were covered entirely in carved symbols. Hundreds of them, possibly thousands, covering every surface in meticulous, deliberate patterns. And in the center of the chamber, placed on a carved stone altar, was the second shield. This one was different from the first, larger, more ornate, the central design depicting what appeared to be a deity or warrior figure surrounded by astronomical symbols. It was extraordinary, clearly the work of master craftspeople, a piece of artwork that suggested high status and significant cultural importance. Sophie moved forward to document it, to photograph it with the meticulous care she'd applied to the first shield. That's when they heard the noise, a scrape of boot on stone echoing from another passage. They weren't alone. Their rival had found the inner sanctum as well, and was coming toward them in the darkness. If this treasure hunt already has you hooked, hit the like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Chapter 7. Confrontation in the dark. The footsteps grew closer, and with them a beam of light cutting through the chamber's darkness. Sophie immediately switched off her flashlight, pulling Marcus into the shadows behind the altar. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Marcus's hand found hers in the dark. The figure emerged into the chamber, a man in his mid-50s, wearing professional archaeological gear, carrying equipment and documentation tools. He moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years in caves, who understood the environment and its hazards. Behind him came a younger man, perhaps in his 30s, carrying mapping equipment. They stopped when they saw the altar and the shield. The older man's breath became audible, sharp, almost gasping. He approached the artifact with reverence that mirrored Sophie's own response, reaching out, then pulling back, as if afraid his touch would disturb something sacred. "My God," he whispered to his companion. "It's intact. After all these years, it's intact." Sophie recognized the accent, Austrian, with the careful diction of someone educated in multiple languages. She recognized something else, too. The voice was familiar somehow, though she couldn't place it. The man pulled out a notebook, sketching the altar and the shield with rapid, expert lines. He seemed to be cataloguing not just the artifact, but the chamber itself, photographing the walls, the symbolic carvings, creating a systematic documentation. "This is the sanctuary," he said to his companion. "This is where the texts placed it. The priests kept 2 shields, one to be discovered, one to be preserved. This is the preserved one." "How do you know about the first shield?" Sophie's voice cut through the darkness. Both men spun toward them, their flashlight beams catching Sophie and Marcus as they stepped from the shadows. The older man's face went white. "Elizabeth's grandchildren," he said softly. Then to his companion, "Leave us." "Dr. Hauptmann, leave, please." The younger man reluctantly gathered his equipment and retreated toward the passage they'd entered from. The older man, Hauptmann, lowered his flashlight beam to the ground, a gesture of non-confrontation. "Your grandmother," he said, "and I were partners in this research. More than partners. We were going to explore these caves together. We were going to document everything and publish it, adding to our understanding of ancient Germanic and Celtic religious practices." Sophie's mind raced. "You're Thomas." Hauptmann nodded. "Her letter. I never responded. I was afraid. I told her I would go with her, but when it came time, I couldn't face the caves. I told myself they were too dangerous, that we needed more equipment, more planning. But really, I was simply afraid. And then she became ill, and I left the university, and I thought the research would die with her." "But you kept searching," Marcus said. "I kept searching," Hauptmann confirmed, "alone, for years. And when I finally found these caves, I realized I was still afraid. So I came back with my colleague, thinking that having company would make it easier. But you're here. You have Elizabeth's work." Sophie held up the camera and Elizabeth's journal that she'd been carrying. Everything. Her maps, her research, her theories. Hauptmann looked at the artifacts, then at the two children. "Your grandmother was brilliant. She understood things about these caves that took me decades to confirm. She would have been a remarkable archaeologist if she'd had the chance." "Why didn't she explore?" Sophie asked. "She had the maps, the knowledge. Why did she stop?" Hauptmann was quiet for a long moment. "Because she fell in love with someone else, your grandfather. He was afraid of the caves, afraid of her spending so much time in dangerous places, and she chose love over discovery. She chose family over archaeology. She made peace with that choice, Sophie. But I think at the end she wanted someone else to complete what she'd started, someone who carried her blood and her curiosity." The chamber seemed to hold its breath. Sophie understood in that moment the full weight of her grandmother's legacy, not just the maps and research, but the choice itself, the conscious decision to prioritize relationship over ambition, to step back from the hunt, but to preserve the hunt for someone else to take up. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked. "Do we fight over the shield? Do we tell people?" Hauptmann looked at the altar, at the ornate shield, at the carved walls surrounding them. "Now," he said slowly, "we do what Elizabeth would have wanted. We document, we preserve, and we decide together, you, me, your parents, perhaps a museum and a university, how to handle this discovery respectfully. These artifacts are sacred. They belong not to us, but to history, and history belongs to everyone." Chapter 8. The Hidden Truth. Over the next month, the three of them, Sophie, Marcus, and Hauptmann, made careful, systematic explorations of the cave system. They mapped every passage, photographed every artifact, and documented the sanctuary chambers with meticulous care. Hauptmann revealed that he'd been deliberately searching for Elizabeth's research after she died, that he'd made connections with local historians who remembered her work, that he'd been trying to finish what they'd started together. He also revealed something else. Elizabeth had not simply stopped exploring. She had discovered documents, ancient texts, referenced in medieval church records, that suggested the caves had been deliberately sealed and hidden by Christian monks in the 9th century CE. The monks had deemed the pagan sanctuary heretical, had attempted to bury the evidence of it, had likely destroyed what they could not seal away. Elizabeth had theorized that the second shield had been protected by the monks themselves, deliberately hidden not to preserve it, but to ensure it could never be found and worshipped again. That meant the monks had known about the inner sanctum. They had deliberately preserved it beneath layers of stone and deliberate misdirection, creating passages that led nowhere, blocking the most direct route to the sanctuary. Your grandmother understood something crucial. Hauptmann explained as they stood in the inner chamber, surrounded by the monks' stone barriers and deliberate obstructions. These caves are a palimpsest of history, layer upon layer of human intention, cultural change, and deliberate acts of preservation and destruction. The shields are not simply artifacts. They are evidence of how different cultures encountered sacred spaces, how they chose to honor or condemn what they found. Sophie found herself thinking about Elizabeth in new ways. Her grandmother hadn't abandoned the search out of fear or love or simple choice. She had stepped back because she understood the cave's complexity, because she understood that some sanctuaries needed to rest undisturbed, that some knowledge could be dangerous if wielded carelessly. Hauptmann helped them prepare a report, careful, academic, respectful, of both the archaeological significance and the sacred nature of the site. They contacted the Bavarian State Office of Heritage Conservation, and within weeks, the caves became a protected archaeological site. Hauptmann coordinated with the university, with museums, with cultural historians from across Europe. The shields were documented in place before any artifact was moved, ensuring that the sanctuary was photographed and preserved in context. The symbolic carvings on the walls were studied and analyzed, revealing influences from Celtic, Germanic, and even Greek traditions, evidence of ancient cultural exchange and religious synthesis that fundamentally altered archaeological understanding of the region. But before any official documentation was released, before the public knew about the discovery, Sophie and Marcus returned to the cave one final time alone. They brought flowers, not modern bouquets, but wildflowers from the forest, gathered with the kind of respect one brings to sacred spaces. They left the flowers on the altar in the sanctuary chamber beside the first shield, now photographed, documented, and soon to be carefully removed for museum preservation. Sophie placed Elizabeth's journal on the altar as well, a gesture that felt right, felt necessary. "She would have liked this," Marcus said. "That we found it together, that we're sharing it with the world." "She would have liked that we understood," Sophie corrected. "That we didn't just take it, that we recognized it as sacred." They sat in the phosphorescent glow of the cave, the bioluminescent organisms creating their pale green light as they had for thousands of years, and thought about Elizabeth, about the generations of people who had visited these caves, about the monks who had tried to erase the sanctuary, about the eventual reclamation of history. "Do you think she knew?" Marcus asked. "That we would find it? That we would do this?" Sophie didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about the way Elizabeth had left the journal, the map, the directions, the deliberate preparation, the careful documentation of knowledge that would be useless unless someone with curiosity and courage and family connection chose to pursue it. "I think she hoped," Sophie finally said. "I think she left the clues and hoped we would be curious enough to follow them. And she was right." Chapter 9. The Meaning of Treasure. The international archaeology community was stunned by the discovery. Peer-reviewed publications detailed the finds. The shields became centerpieces in exhibitions about ancient religious practices, and Sophie received her first academic invitation before completing secondary school to present her documentation methodology at a youth archaeology forum. But the most significant discovery came later, when Hauptmann was translating some of the carved inscriptions in the inner sanctum. One particular carving, roughly at eye level on the eastern wall, when translated from ancient Germanic runes, read, "They come when the earth is ready. They carry the knowledge of those who came before. They become the bridge between what was and what will be." Hauptmann brought the translation to Sophie and Marcus. "I think Elizabeth saw this carving years ago in whatever photographs or descriptions she found. I think she recognized herself in it, the role of someone who discovers but doesn't possess, who documents but doesn't claim, who hands knowledge forward to the next generation. The shields themselves revealed their own story through restoration and analysis. The first shield, the offering shield, bore signs of ritual use. Scratches and dents consistent with ceremonial striking. Patterns of wear that suggested it had been carried and displayed. The second shield, the hidden one, was pristine, untouched by use, preserved in the darkness as a kind of time capsule. Archaeologists hypothesized that the second shield represented a covenant, a sacred object intentionally kept from the world, hidden away with the expectation that one day in the future someone would find it and understand its significance. It was preservation not for greed or ownership, but for meaning. It was a message across time. 3 years after the initial discovery, Sophie stood in a museum in Munich, looking at the shields displayed in a carefully climate-controlled case, alongside detailed information about the cave system, the excavation methodology, and the history of the sanctuary. Her name appeared on the placard as a co-documentarian of the site, but beside the shields was something else, Elizabeth's journal in a protective case, open to the page where she'd written about the inner sanctum, about the priests keeping 2 shields, about the possibility of discovery. The museum had included Elizabeth's name as the original researcher, crediting her work, even though she'd never physically entered the caves herself. Marcus stood beside Sophie as they looked at the display. Their parents had driven to Munich for the opening of the exhibition, bringing flowers and pride and a kind of bewilderment at what their quiet children had accomplished over one unexpected summer. "Do you think she's happy?" Marcus asked, nodding toward Elizabeth's journal. Sophie thought about the phosphorescent glow in the sanctuary, about the monks' deliberate barriers and obstacles, about the slow process of discovery and documentation, about the choices Elizabeth had made between ambition and love, between personal achievement and family, between possession and preservation. "I think she would say that happiness isn't the right measure," Sophie replied. "I think she would say the right measure is whether the truth was honored, whether the sacred was respected, whether knowledge was passed forward not as treasure to be claimed, but as responsibility to be carried." That evening, alone in her hotel room, Sophie opened her phone and looked at her photographs of the inner sanctum. The shields, the carved walls, the glowing phosphorescent walls that had no supernatural explanation, but somehow seemed sacred anyway. She thought about Elizabeth, who had stood at the cave entrance 70 years ago and turned back, who had spent decades preserving knowledge that would outlive her, who had trusted that curiosity and family bonds would eventually complete what she'd started. Sophie opened a new document on her laptop and began writing. She was documenting her own excavation experience, not for academic publication, but for someone else. Someone in her future family who might inherit this story, who might one day wonder about the caves beneath the Bavarian Alps and the shields that waited in the earth. She was becoming like Elizabeth, a bridge between what had been and what would be, a keeper of stories, a preserver of meaning, and unlike her grandmother, she would not turn back. She would not let the knowledge rest. She would carry it forward, hand it to the next generation, and trust that curiosity and courage would ensure that the sacred would always be found by those worthy of finding it. The treasure, Sophie understood now, was never the shields themselves. It was the journey to them, the respect shown to them, the willingness to prioritize understanding over possession. It was Elizabeth's journal, still in the cave until the moment of its discovery. It was Hauptmann's decades of solitary searching. It was Sophie and Marcus's decision to document rather than claim, to preserve rather than possess. The treasure was the meaning itself, the knowledge that history exists not to be conquered, but to be honored. That discovery is not an ending, but a beginning, that some quests span generations, and the greatest reward is knowing that you have become part of something larger than yourself. Epilogue. Where the Earth remembers. The Bavarian caves remained open to carefully controlled archaeological expeditions. They became a landmark in the study of ancient religious syncretism, cited in hundreds of academic papers, visited by researchers from around the world, but they never became a tourist destination. The sanctuary chambers, where Elizabeth and her grandchildren had first glimpsed the shields in their phosphorescent glow, remained protected, accessible only to approved researchers. Sophie completed her university degree in archaeology, specializing in artifact preservation. Marcus became a documentary filmmaker, eventually creating a three-part series about the caves that won international recognition. Hauptmann retired from his academic position but continued collaborating with them. His life's obsession finally resolved, not through personal discovery, but through partnership and shared responsibility. Years later, when Sophie had children of her own, she took them, first at age 12, then at age 14, into the caves. She showed them the sanctuary, explained the history, told them about Elizabeth's maps and Hauptmann's search and Marcus's films. She explained that they were part of a lineage of discovery, of people who had chosen to honor rather than exploit, to preserve rather than claim. And in the inner chamber, where the second shield had rested for nearly 2,000 years, where it had waited through centuries of darkness and deliberate concealment, where it had finally been found and documented and preserved, Sophie told them the most important truth. The Earth remembers. It remembers every person who walked these passages with respect. It remembers every discovery and every choice to protect what was sacred, and now you will carry that memory forward. You will be the bridge between what was and what will be. The phosphorescent organisms glowed in their pale green light, ancient and patient and eternal. The carved walls held their symbols. The shields rested in their museum case, preserved for generations to come. And somewhere, in the space between past and future, Elizabeth's smile was quiet and knowing, the smile of someone who had stepped back from her own ambition, but who had ensured that the quest would continue, that the sacred would be honored, that discovery would always serve meaning rather than greed. The adventure was not over. It was never over. It was a quest that would pass from generation to generation, a responsibility encoded in blood and curiosity, a treasure that could only be possessed by those willing to preserve it. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of discovery and hidden history. See you in the next adventure.